My name is Grace, and I'm a primary school teacher here in Manchester. What I'm about to tell you happened on my 30th birthday, a day that changed everything. You see, I thought I was living a normal life with my husband David and his mother Margaret. I thought the small compromises I made every day were just part of being a good wife. I was wrong about a lot of things back then. But I was absolutely right about one thing. Sometimes you have to smash more than just a birthday cake to find your way back to yourself. I'd spent the entire week preparing for this party. Our semi-detached house in Chorlton had never looked better. I'd scrubbed every surface, arranged fresh flowers in every room, and spent hours in the kitchen making my grandmother's Victoria sponge recipe. The cake was my pride and joy, 3 layers of golden sponge with strawberry jam and fresh cream, decorated with delicate sugar roses I'd crafted myself. Margaret had arrived that morning with 2 suitcases, ostensibly for a weekend visit. She immediately began rearranging my flower displays, muttering about poor presentation standards under her breath. David said nothing as she moved through our home like a general inspecting troops, finding fault with everything from the placement of the napkins to the temperature of the sitting room. "Grace, dear," she said, her voice dripping with false sweetness, "don't you think the table setting is rather ambitious for someone of your background? Perhaps something simpler would be more appropriate." I bit my tongue and smiled, the way I'd learned to do over 3 years of marriage. "Of course, Margaret. Would you like to rearrange it?" David beamed at his mother's approval as she bustled about, undoing hours of my careful work. I retreated to the kitchen, hands shaking as I put the finishing touches on the cake. This was supposed to be my day. My birthday. My celebration. The guests arrived at 2 o'clock, my sister Claire, a few colleagues from school, some of David's friends from the warehouse where he worked, and several neighbors. Everyone complimented the spread, the decorations, the lovely atmosphere. For a brief moment, I felt proud of what I'd accomplished. Margaret positioned herself near the cake table, regaling everyone with stories about David's childhood, subtly inserting comments about how lucky he was to find someone willing to learn proper homemaking skills and how some young wives today simply don't understand the importance of family traditions. When it came time to cut the cake, I picked up the knife, smiling as everyone gathered around to sing. The moment felt perfect, exactly as I'd imagined it during all those hours of preparation. "Stop." David's voice cut through the cheerful chatter like a blade. Every conversation died. Every smile froze. I looked up at him in confusion, the knife suspended halfway to the cake. "You should have asked Mum first," he said, his voice cold and matter-of-fact. "She cuts the cake first at all family celebrations. That's how it's always been done in our family." I stared at him, feeling the blood drain from my face. "But David, it's my birthday. It's my cake." His expression darkened. Before I could react, his hand struck my cheek. The sharp sound echoed through the silent room. My face stung, my ears rang, and for a moment, I couldn't breathe. "Don't be selfish, Grace. Show some respect," he said quietly, as if nothing had happened. The room was so quiet I could hear the clock ticking on the mantelpiece. 20 pairs of eyes watched us, some shocked, some embarrassed, some deliberately looking away. Margaret stood beside her son, arms crossed, a satisfied smile playing at the corners of her mouth. Something inside me snapped. 3 years of being corrected, criticized, and controlled. 3 years of being made to feel like a guest in my own home. 3 years of watching my opinions dismissed and my efforts diminished. I looked at the beautiful cake I'd spent hours creating, then at David's expectant face, then at Margaret's smug expression. Very slowly, very deliberately, I picked up the entire cake and smashed it directly into my husband's face. The gasps were audible. Cream and jam splattered across his shirt, sugar roses scattered on the floor, and chunks of sponge slid down his chin. For a moment, nobody moved. Nobody breathed. Margaret's shriek of outrage broke the spell. "How dare you? David, are you going to let her treat you like this? In front of guests?" I set the empty plate down, wiped my hands on a tea towel, and walked calmly towards the stairs. Behind me, I could hear David apologizing profusely to his mother, not to our guests, not to me, but to her. His voice was panicked, desperate for her forgiveness. In the bathroom, I locked the door and looked at my reflection in the mirror. My cheek was red, my hands were trembling, but for the first time in years, I recognized the woman looking back at me. She had fire in her eyes. She had fight left in her. I sat on the edge of the bathtub and, for the first time in 3 years of marriage, allowed myself to cry. Not from sadness, but from something else entirely. Relief, perhaps. Or awakening. Downstairs, I could hear the party dispersing, hushed voices offering awkward goodbyes. David's voice, getting louder, more frustrated. Margaret's theatrical sobs about disrespect and poor upbringing. But up here, in the quiet sanctuary of our bathroom, one question echoed in my mind over and over again. What have I become? 3 days passed in complete silence. David moved through our house like a ghost, avoiding eye contact, sleeping in the spare room. He'd cleaned the cake remnants from the carpet himself that night, methodically picking up every sugar rose petal whilst I watched from the top of the stairs. Not once did he mention what had happened. Not once did he apologize. The red mark on my cheek had faded, but the memory of that sharp crack echoed in my mind constantly. I found myself touching the spot throughout the day, remembering the shocked silence that had followed. 20 people had witnessed my husband strike me, and not one had said a word. Margaret, however, had plenty to say. She rang every morning at precisely 9 o'clock, her voice sharp with indignation. Grace needs to learn her place, I'd hear her telling David through the thin walls. That display was absolutely disgraceful. In my day, wives knew how to behave properly. David's responses were always the same apologetic murmurs. Yes, Mum. You're absolutely right, Mum. I'll speak to her, Mum. But he never did speak to me. We existed in the same space like strangers, passing each other in the hallway without acknowledgement. He made his own breakfast, left for the warehouse without a goodbye, and returned in the evenings to eat whatever I'd prepared in continued silence. I returned to work on the Wednesday, grateful for the normalcy of Year 2 classroom routines. The children's laughter felt like medicine after days of oppressive quiet. During my lunch break, I sat in the staff room with my colleague Sarah, picking at a sandwich I had no appetite for. You look dreadful, Sarah said bluntly, settling into the chair beside me with her cup of tea. What's happened? Sarah was one of those rare people who saw everything but said little unless directly asked. She'd been teaching for 15 years, had raised 3 children alone after her divorce, and possessed an uncanny ability to spot trouble from a mile away. I hesitated, then found myself telling her everything. The birthday party, Margaret's constant criticism, David's public humiliation, the slap that came from nowhere, and my explosive response with the cake. The words tumbled out like water through a broken dam. Sarah listened without interruption, her expression growing more serious with each detail. When I finished, she set down her teacup with deliberate care. Grace, she said quietly, that's not normal behavior. My ex-husband used to control me in similar ways. The constant criticism, making me feel small, prioritizing his mother's opinions over mine. It starts gradually, so gradually you don't notice until you're drowning. I shook my head instinctively. David's not abusive, Sarah. He's never, well, except for the slap, but that was just one moment of anger. He was embarrassed by what I did. Control comes in many forms, she replied gently. Physical violence is just one tool. Tell me, when did you last make a decision about your own life without considering David's reaction first? The question hit me like a physical blow. I sat there, sandwich forgotten, trying to remember the last time I'd chosen anything, what to wear, what to watch on television, how to spend my Saturday, without first calculating David's likely response. That's what I thought, Sarah said softly. Grace, I want you to have a think about something. The woman who smashed that cake into her husband's face. She's still in there somewhere. You just need to find her again. That evening, I sat in our sitting room whilst David watched the news, his dinner plate balanced on his lap. Margaret had rung twice during the meal, each conversation leaving him more agitated. I studied his profile in the flickering light of the television, this man I'd married 3 years ago with such hope and excitement. When had he stopped asking about my day? When had my opinions become inconveniences to be dismissed? When had I started apologizing for existing in my own home? The woman Sarah had described, the one who'd fought back with birthday cake, felt like someone I'd read about in a book. But as I sat there in the gathering darkness, I could almost remember what it felt like to have opinions that mattered, to make choices without fear. Upstairs in our bedroom later that night, I stood before the mirror and looked at my reflection properly for the first time in months. Pale skin, worried eyes, shoulders permanently hunched as if bracing for the next criticism. I barely recognized myself. But somewhere behind those tired eyes, I caught a glimpse of something else. A flicker of the woman I used to be. The woman who'd once had dreams bigger than keeping the peace in her own home. I whispered to my reflection, "What happened to you, Grace?" Sarah's words haunted me for the rest of the week. Every interaction with David felt different now, as if I was seeing our marriage through a magnifying glass for the first time. The way he checked what I was cooking before deciding whether to approve. The way he answered questions directed at me in public. The way he'd begun leaving Margaret's phone calls on speaker, ensuring I heard every criticism. "Grace needs proper guidance," Margaret's voice would echo through the kitchen whilst I prepared dinner. "She's clearly never been taught how to run a household properly. Perhaps I should come and stay for a while, just until she learns." David's response always came too quickly. "That's very generous of you, Mum. Grace would benefit enormously from your experience." They spoke about me as if I wasn't standing 3 feet away, washing up dishes with increasingly violent precision. The inevitable happened on Friday evening. Margaret arrived with 2 large suitcases and a proprietary smile, announcing she'd be staying indefinitely to help me develop proper domestic skills. David carried her luggage to our spare room whilst she surveyed our sitting room with the critical eye of a property inspector. "This will need considerable work," she declared, running her finger along the mantelpiece and examining it for dust. "David, dear, you've been far too patient with this situation." Within hours of her arrival, Margaret had rearranged our entire kitchen, relocating items to more sensible positions. She moved my grandmother's recipe collection from its place of honor beside the cooker to a bottom drawer, claiming it was cluttering the workspace. She reorganized the spice rack according to her own mysterious system and posted a handwritten schedule on the refrigerator outlining meal times, cleaning rotas, and appropriate behavior expectations. "Wives today have lost sight of proper priorities," she informed me over breakfast on Saturday morning, whilst David nodded approvingly from behind his newspaper. "In my generation, we understood that marriage required sacrifice, discipline, and respect for family traditions." I bit my tongue and poured her more tea, the way I'd learned to do. But something inside me was changing. Sarah's question kept returning. When had I last made a decision about my own life without calculating David's reaction first? The answer was becoming clearer every day. I couldn't remember. Margaret's rules multiplied like weeds. I needed permission to watch television programs she deemed inappropriate. Friends couldn't visit without advance approval and proper notification. I was expected to ask before using household items, from the washing machine to the telephone. Even my choice of clothing required her input. "That dress is rather bright, don't you think, dear?" she'd say each morning, her tone suggesting my wardrobe choices were deliberate acts of rebellion. Perhaps something more subdued would be more suitable for a married woman. David observed these interactions with the detached interest of someone watching a television program about other people's lives. When I looked to him for support, for any sign that he recognized the absurdity of the situation, he would simply nod and return to his newspaper or his dinner. The breaking point came on Wednesday evening. I'd spent the afternoon at school helping with after-school club, returning home slightly later than usual. Margaret was waiting in the hallway, her expression thunderous. "Where have you been?" she demanded, as if addressing an errant teenager. "Dinner should have been prepared an hour ago. David has been waiting." I explained about the school commitment, a voluntary program I'd been helping with for months. Margaret's response was swift and decisive. "Married women have no business gallivanting about after-school hours," she announced. "Your responsibilities are here, in this house, looking after your husband properly. I'll be speaking to David about this ridiculous hobby of yours." That night, lying in bed beside David's silent form, I stared at the ceiling and tried to remember the person I'd been before marriage. I'd been training to become a fully qualified teacher. I'd had opinions about politics, books, films. I'd made decisions about my own time, my own interests, my own future. Margaret's presence had simply amplified what had been happening gradually for 3 years. David's slow erosion of my independence, my confidence, my sense of self. But the woman who'd smashed a birthday cake into her husband's face was still somewhere inside me. Sarah had been right about that. I could feel her stirring, growing stronger with each of Margaret's demands, each of David's silent endorsements of his mother's authority over my life. As Margaret's snoring drifted through the thin walls from the spare room, I whispered into the darkness, "I won't disappear completely." It was a promise to myself. The first one I'd made in years. Margaret's tyranny settled into our house like a persistent illness. 2 weeks into her stay, I'd begun documenting every incident in a small notebook I kept hidden in my handbag. What started as an attempt to make sense of my situation quickly became a shocking revelation of how controlled my life had become. Tuesday, Margaret threw away my grandmother's recipe book without permission. When confronted, she claimed it was cluttering the kitchen and encouraging unrealistic cooking ambitions. Wednesday, David cancelled our dinner plans with my sister Claire, claiming Margaret needed help settling in properly. Thursday, Margaret opened and read my post before I returned from work, then questioned me about a letter from the teacher training college regarding qualification opportunities. The list grew longer each day. I found myself writing during my lunch breaks at school, my hand trembling as I recorded the slow erasure of my independence. The notebook became both evidence and lifeline, proof that I wasn't imagining the gradual disappearance of my autonomy. Sarah noticed the change immediately. During our Thursday lunch break, she found me scribbling furiously in the staff room corner. "Grace, you look like you haven't slept in weeks," she said, settling beside me with her usual directness. "How long is David's mother staying?" I looked up from my notebook, realizing I'd been unconsciously hunching over it like a guilty schoolchild. "Indefinitely, apparently. She's helping me develop proper domestic skills." Sarah's expression darkened. "Proper domestic skills? Grace, you're a grown woman with a university degree. You don't need anyone's mother teaching you how to run your own household." The words hung between us like a revelation. When had I started accepting that I needed guidance for basic life decisions? When had I begun believing that my instincts were fundamentally flawed? "I've been writing it all down," I admitted, showing her a few entries from the notebook. "Just to help me make sense of things." Sarah read in silence, her expression growing more serious with each line. When she finished, she looked up with something approaching anger in her eyes. "Grace, this isn't normal family dynamics. This is systematic control. You're being managed like a child, and your husband is allowing it to happen." That evening, Margaret intercepted a phone call from Claire whilst I was preparing dinner. I heard her voice drifting from the hallway, sweet as poisoned honey. "Grace is rather busy learning proper household management at the moment," she told my sister. "Perhaps you could ring back in a few weeks when she's less overwhelmed with domestic responsibilities." I dropped the wooden spoon I'd been stirring with and rushed to the phone, but Margaret had already hung up. When I asked why she'd answered my call, her response was delivered with infuriating calm. "The telephone was ringing, dear. I was simply being helpful. Claire seemed to understand that you're going through an important learning period right now." David's reaction when I told him was worse than Margaret's interference. He simply shrugged and returned to his evening newspaper. "Mum was just being practical, Grace. Claire calls too often anyway. You need to focus on more important things." That night, I sat in our bedroom and called Claire back from my mobile, keeping my voice low. When she answered, her confusion was immediately apparent. "Grace, I rang earlier but your mother-in-law said you were too busy to talk. She made it sound like you were going through some sort of crisis." Hearing my sister's concerned voice, I found myself crying for the first time since the bathroom incident after the birthday party. The words poured out: Margaret's invasion, the constant criticism, David's complete support for his mother's behavior, my growing sense that I was disappearing inside my own life. Claire listened with the patience of someone who'd known me for 30 years. "Pack a bag and come here right now," she said immediately when I finished. "This isn't normal, Grace. This isn't marriage. This is something else entirely." But I couldn't. Not yet. The house was quiet, David and Margaret were downstairs, and I was whispering into my phone like a teenager breaking curfew. The woman who'd once made confident decisions about her career, her friendships, her future had been replaced by someone who needed permission to speak to her own sister. I can't just leave, I whispered. Not without a proper plan. Then make one, Claire said firmly. But Grace, please promise me you'll start thinking about what you want, not just what they expect. After I hung up, I sat in the darkness of our bedroom and opened my notebook to a fresh page. At the top, I wrote, "What do I want?" It was the first time I'd asked myself that question in years. Sarah introduced me to Emma on a grey Monday morning during our break. Emma worked at the Manchester Women's Centre, a small building tucked between a charity shop and a cafe on the high street. She had kind eyes and the sort of calm presence that made people want to tell her their deepest secrets. "Grace has been having some difficulties at home," Sarah explained simply. "I thought you two should meet." Emma listened without judgment as I explained my situation, occasionally nodding or asking gentle questions. She never used words like abuse or victim. Instead, she spoke about patterns of control and healthy boundaries in a way that felt educational rather than accusatory. "What you're describing is called coercive control," she said when I finished. "It's a systematic pattern of behavior designed to make someone feel dependent and powerless. The important thing to understand is that it's not your fault, and you're not imagining it." She gave me leaflets about local support services, information about legal rights, and most importantly, permission to trust my own instincts. For the first time in months, someone was telling me that my feelings were valid. I began attending weekly lunch hour sessions at the center, telling David and Margaret I was taking additional professional development courses. The lie came surprisingly easily, perhaps because it felt like the first decision I'd made entirely for myself in years. Each session revealed new aspects of my situation that I'd normalized. Other women shared stories that sounded disturbingly familiar: partners who controlled household finances, families who interfered with friendships, husbands who made unilateral decisions about their wives' lives. "The isolation happens gradually," explained one woman whose experience mirrored mine. "First, they make it difficult to see friends. Then they create drama around family visits. Before you know it, you're completely dependent on them for social contact." I thought about Claire's confused phone call, about friends who'd stopped ringing, about social invitations I'd declined because David found them unnecessary or inappropriate. During my third session, Emma mentioned something that made my heart race. Many women find it helpful to have their own financial independence, even if it's just a small emergency fund. It provides options. That afternoon, I opened a secret bank account at a branch near school. The building society manager, a woman roughly my age, processed the paperwork without question. I deposited £20 from my monthly allowance, money I'd saved by walking to work instead of taking the bus. It wasn't much, but it felt revolutionary. Margaret discovered my notebook 3 weeks later. I'd hidden it in my handbag, but she'd been searching through my things whilst I was at work. When I arrived home, she was waiting in the kitchen with David, the notebook open on the table between them. "What is this ridiculous collection of complaints?" she demanded, her voice sharp with outrage. "Are you documenting our family's private business like some sort of investigative journalist?" David's face was thunderous. "Planning to leave me, are you, Grace?" His voice was eerily calm, which somehow made it more frightening than if he'd shouted. "You ungrateful little cow. Where would you go? What would you do? You'd be nothing without this family." Margaret stood beside him, arms crossed, wearing an expression of satisfied vindication. "I told you she was ungrateful, David. Some women simply don't appreciate the security and guidance of proper marriage." I denied everything, of course. I claimed the notebook was just personal reflections, that I'd never considered leaving, that I was grateful for their patience with my shortcomings. The words tasted like ash in my mouth, but they seemed to satisfy them. That night, lying in bed beside David's rigid silence, I thought about the £27 now in my secret account. It wasn't enough to change my life, but it represented something more important than money. It represented possibility. And for the first time in years, possibility felt like hope. The discovery of my notebook changed everything. David's surveillance became relentless and methodical, like living under the watchful eye of a particularly dedicated prison guard. He began driving me to and from school each day, claiming it was more efficient and would save petrol money. The real reason was obvious: control of my movements. Margaret was given full permission to conduct daily searches of my belongings. She went through my handbag each morning whilst I prepared breakfast, examining every receipt, every scrap of paper, every item with the thoroughness of a customs officer. My mobile phone was confiscated during evening hours, ostensibly because family time shouldn't include unnecessary distractions. "We're only trying to help you focus on what's truly important," Margaret explained with full sympathy whilst pocketing my phone after dinner. Modern women get so easily confused by too many choices and responsibilities. The isolation was suffocating. When Emma tried calling the house phone to follow up on our missed sessions, Margaret answered and informed her that I was no longer requiring outside counseling services. When my colleague Sarah asked about my sudden absence from lunch breaks, I had to lie and say I was taking private tutoring sessions in the school library. The secret bank account became my lifeline and my greatest fear simultaneously. Each week, I managed to deposit a few pounds, money scraped together from walking everywhere and skipping lunch. By November, I'd saved £43, a pathetic sum that nonetheless represented the only independence I had left. Then Mrs. Thompson, our headteacher, called me into her office with an opportunity that made my heart leap and sink in equal measure. "Grace," she said, settling behind her desk with a warm smile, "I've been watching your work with the children, and I'm impressed. We've got a long-term sick leave situation in Year 3, and I'd like to offer you the chance to step up. It would mean fast-tracking your teacher training through our emergency qualification program." My dream job. The career I'd abandoned after marrying David because he'd convinced me it was too ambitious for someone of my background. Mrs. Thompson was offering me exactly what I'd always wanted: a chance to become a fully qualified teacher. "The position would require some evening classes and weekend preparation time," she continued. "I know it's a big commitment, but I believe you're ready for the challenge." I wanted to say yes immediately. Every fiber of my being screamed acceptance. But the practical reality of my situation crushed that enthusiasm like a physical weight. "I'd need to discuss it with my husband," I heard myself saying, the words sounding foreign and shameful in my own ears. That evening, I mentioned the opportunity as casually as possible over dinner, trying to downplay the additional hours while emphasizing the increased income. David's reaction was swift and predictable. "Absolutely not," he said without looking up from his plate. "You can barely manage your current responsibilities properly. Taking on more work would be completely inappropriate." Margaret nodded approvingly. "David's quite right, dear. Married women with proper priorities don't need careers. Your job should be supplementing household income, not pursuing personal ambitions." I tried again, explaining the professional development opportunities, the respect it would bring, the long-term financial benefits. But David's expression grew darker with each word. I said, "No, Grace. The discussion is finished. You'll ring Mrs. Thompson tomorrow and decline politely." That night, I lay awake calculating escape routes. £43 wouldn't get me far, but Claire had offered her spare room. I could stay with her temporarily, accept the teaching position, and rebuild my independence slowly. But David's threat from the notebook incident haunted me. He'd promised that if I ever tried to leave, he would ensure I never worked with children again through character assassination and professional sabotage. He knew people in the Education Authority. He could make accusations that would destroy my career before it properly began. The trap had been carefully constructed over 3 years, and now it was tightening around me with suffocating precision. In the darkness, I whispered my new mantra: £43. It's a start. But start towards what? And when would I find the courage to take that first step? The opportunity I'd been unconsciously waiting for arrived in the form of David's cousin's wedding in Edinburgh. A family obligation that would take both David and Margaret away for an entire weekend, leaving me alone in the house for the first time in months. "You'll stay here and catch up on proper housework," Margaret announced whilst packing her second suitcase. "The spare room needs a thorough cleaning, and the kitchen cupboards require complete reorganization. I've left you a detailed list of tasks that should keep you appropriately occupied." David nodded approvingly. No visitors whilst we're gone, Grace. And definitely no unnecessary phone calls to your sister. This weekend is for productive domestic work, not social distractions. I nodded meekly, playing the obedient wife they expected me to be. But inside, something fierce and determined was awakening. This was my chance, perhaps my only chance, to take meaningful action. The moment their taxi disappeared around the corner on Friday evening, I began moving with purpose I hadn't felt in years. First, I rang Emma at the Women's Center, explaining my situation and asking for urgent advice about legal rights and practical steps for leaving an abusive marriage. Document everything, she advised. Gather important papers, identification, any evidence of the control and intimidation. And Grace, do you have somewhere safe to go? My sister Claire, I replied, my voice steadier than it had been in months. She's been offering her spare room for weeks. Next, I called Claire, who answered on the second ring. Grace, how are you managing with the house guests from hell? They're away for the weekend, I said. Claire, I need to ask you something important. That offer of your spare room, does it still stand? Of course it does. What's happened? I told her about Mrs. Thompson's teaching opportunity, about David's flat refusal, about Margaret's daily searches and the confiscated mobile phone. About feeling like a prisoner in my own home. Claire's response was immediate and fierce. Pack a bag right now and come here. Tonight. But I'd learned to plan carefully. Impulsive actions led to mistakes, and I couldn't afford mistakes. Not yet, I said. I need to do this properly. Gather documents, speak to a solicitor, understand my rights. I've got the whole weekend to prepare. Saturday morning, I took the bus to the city centre and met with a solicitor who specialised in domestic abuse cases. She explained my legal options, my rights regarding the house and finances, and most importantly, the support services available to help me establish independence. The key is documentation, she emphasised. Everything you can remember, every incident of control or intimidation. It helps establish the pattern of behaviour for potential legal proceedings. I spent Saturday evening at the kitchen table, creating a comprehensive record of the past months. The notebook Margaret had discovered was nothing compared to this detailed account of systematic control, isolation, and intimidation. Every cancelled social engagement, every intercepted phone call, every decision made without my input. Sunday afternoon, I packed a small suitcase with essential items, documents, a few clothes, photographs, and my grandmother's wedding ring that Margaret hadn't yet confiscated. I hid the case in the garden shed, behind the lawnmower where nobody would think to look. When David and Margaret returned Sunday evening, I was the perfect picture of domestic compliance. Dinner prepared precisely on time, house spotless according to Margaret's impossible standards, submissive smile firmly in place. The house looks acceptable, Margaret conceded grudgingly whilst inspecting the kitchen. Perhaps you're finally learning to use your time more productively. David barely acknowledged my efforts, but I noticed him checking the mileage on his car and examining the house for signs of unauthorized activity. Finding nothing suspicious, he settled into his evening routine with satisfied complacency. That night, lying beside his sleeping form, I felt different. The frightened, confused woman who'd smashed a birthday cake in desperate rebellion had evolved into someone with a plan, legal knowledge, and most importantly, genuine hope. My secret bank account now held £57. Not much, but combined with Claire's support and Mrs. Thompson's job offer, it represented the foundation of a different life. For the first time in years, I fell asleep smiling. Wednesday morning arrived grey and drizzly, perfectly ordinary in every way except for what I knew it would become, my liberation day. David dropped me at school as usual, reminding me to behave sensibly and promising to collect me at the normal time. I smiled and waved goodbye, knowing it would be the last time I'd pretend to be the submissive wife he'd tried to create. Mrs. Thompson was waiting for me in her office before first period. Grace, I need an answer about the Year 3 position, she said kindly but firmly. I can't hold it open much longer. I accept, I replied without hesitation. And Mrs. Thompson, I need to tell you something important about my personal situation. I explained everything, the control, the isolation, Margaret's interference, David's threats about sabotaging my career. Mrs. Thompson listened with the grave attention of someone who'd seen this pattern before in her years of education management. "You'll have the school's full support," she promised. "If anyone attempts to interfere with your employment here through false allegations or character assassination, they'll be dealing with our legal department and the local authority. You're a valued member of staff, Grace, and we protect our own." At lunchtime, instead of entering the school building, I walked to the back gate where Claire sat waiting in her small blue Ford. My heart hammered as I approached her car, a canvas bag containing my most essential possessions clutched tightly in my hands. "Ready?" she asked simply. "Ready," I replied, and meant it. The drive to Claire's house took 20 minutes through Manchester's afternoon traffic. 20 minutes to travel from one life to another. I spent them staring out the window, watching familiar streets pass by, feeling simultaneously terrified and exhilarated. Claire's spare room was small but perfect: white walls, clean linen, a window overlooking her garden. It smelled of lavender and possibility. "You can stay as long as you need," she said, setting down my bag. "But Grace, you know David will react badly when he realizes what's happened." By 4 o'clock, I'd contacted my solicitor, informed the Women's Center of my new address, and transferred what remained in our joint bank account to my secret account. Not much money, but enough for immediate necessities. At 5:30, David's first call came. Claire answered, her voice calm and professional. "Grace has left you, David. She's safe, she's made her decision, and she won't be returning. Any further contact should go through her solicitor." The explosion was audible even from across the room. David's voice, raised in fury and disbelief, demanding to know where I was, threatening legal action, promising consequences. Claire hung up after 30 seconds and immediately blocked his number. The calls continued throughout the evening: David's mobile, the house phone, even Margaret calling to shriek about disgraceful behavior and abandoning family responsibilities. Each attempt was blocked, each threat documented. By 9 o'clock, David had driven to Claire's house and was pounding on the front door, shouting demands through the letterbox. Claire called the police whilst I sat in the kitchen, shaking but determined. When the officers arrived, David's demeanor changed instantly. He became the reasonable husband, concerned about his confused wife who'd been influenced by interfering family members. The performance was masterful, but the police had heard it all before. "Sir, your wife has the right to leave the marital home if she chooses," the sergeant explained patiently. "Any further attempts to contact her without her consent constitute harassment. I suggest you return home and consider seeking legal advice through proper channels." After David left, I sat in Claire's sitting room with a cup of tea and looked at my reflection in the dark window. The woman staring back at me was still pale, still nervous, but there was something different in her eyes. Something that hadn't been there for years. Strength. That night, lying in an unfamiliar bed in an unfamiliar room, I listened to the sounds of a house where I was wanted and respected. No Margaret snoring through thin walls, no David's cold silence, no atmosphere of constant judgment and control. For the first time in 3 years, I felt like myself again. 6 months later, I stood before my own Year 3 classroom, watching 28 eager faces settle into their seats for the first day of the new term. The qualified teacher badge pinned to my blazer still felt miraculous, a tangible symbol of everything I'd fought to reclaim. The divorce had been finalized 3 weeks earlier. David had eventually stopped his harassment campaign after violating the restraining order twice, leading to court appearances and stern judicial warnings. Margaret had returned to her own flat, though she still sent occasional poisonous letters that went straight into my solicitor's files. My small flat in Didsbury was nothing grand: 1 bedroom, a tiny kitchen, a sitting room that doubled as my marking space. But every item in it had been chosen by me, arranged according to my preferences, paid for with money I'd earned through my own efforts. The difference between this space and the house I'd shared with David was the difference between breathing freely and suffocating slowly. Claire had been my anchor during those turbulent early months. Her spare room had become my sanctuary whilst I rebuilt not just my practical life, but my sense of self. We'd spent countless evenings talking about dreams I'd abandoned, ambitions I'd forgotten. The woman I'd been before marriage taught me to diminish myself. "You're glowing," she'd said recently, studying my face over Sunday lunch. "You look like Grace again. The real one." The teaching qualification program had been demanding but exhilarating. Evening classes, weekend workshops, practical assessments, all the things David had declared inappropriate for a married woman. Mrs. Thompson had been instrumental in fast-tracking my progress, and I'd thrown myself into every assignment with the passion of someone making up for lost time. Support from the Women's Center had continued throughout my transition. Emma had become more than a counselor, she'd become a friend who understood the complex process of rebuilding confidence after systematic erosion. The weekly support group meetings had shown me I wasn't alone, that my experience was part of a sadly common pattern, but also that recovery and independence were entirely possible. Financial independence had been harder won but deeply satisfying. The teacher's salary wasn't generous, but it was mine. No allowances, no monitoring, no justifications required for spending decisions. I'd opened a proper savings account, started a pension plan, and even treated myself to small luxuries that would have required committee approval in my previous life. Dating had been the last frontier. Tom, a fellow teacher from a neighboring primary school, had asked me for coffee 3 times before I'd found the courage to say yes. He was patient with my nervousness, understanding about my need to take things slowly, respectful of boundaries that probably seemed excessive to someone who hadn't lived through systematic control. "You're worth waiting for," he'd said simply when I'd attempted to explain my complicated past. "Everyone has a story, Grace. Yours just makes you stronger." The scars remained, of course. I still over-apologized for normal requests, still felt a flutter of anxiety when men raised their voices, still sometimes woke from dreams where Margaret was rearranging my possessions whilst David watched approvingly. But these responses were fading, becoming echoes rather than constant realities. As my students settled into their morning routine, I caught my reflection in the classroom window. The woman looking back had confidence in her posture, purpose in her expression, and something that had been missing for years, genuine happiness. My mobile buzzed with a text from Tom: "Good luck on your first day, though I know you'll be brilliant. Dinner tonight to celebrate?" I typed back quickly, "Perfect. I'll choose the restaurant." Such a simple thing, choosing where to eat dinner. But for someone who'd spent 3 years having every decision made by committee, it felt revolutionary. "Miss Grace," called out one of my new pupils, "are you ready to start our lessons?" I smiled, straightened my shoulders, and turned to face the classroom full of possibilities. "Absolutely," I replied. "Let's begin."